So welcome everybody to Elaine's Literary Salon. I'm Jeffrey Higgins. This is my wife Cynthia's and my restaurant. We are Alexandrian cuisine based on our family recipes from the original Alexandria in Egypt. We've turned this into a safe haven for authors where they can come and celebrate their work. Honestly, it's one of my pure joys sitting here with authors and hearing what they have to say. It's like a little treasure. I love it. We do have a podcast. It's Elaine's Literary Salon. You can find us at elainesliterarysalon.com. We're currently number 1 on Spotify and number 3 on Apple for a literary podcast, so please check us out. And if you go to elainesliterarysalon.com, follow us. We'll have a newsletter goes out about once a month just to give you an idea of who's coming. We have at least one author a week, sometimes up to 4. So, a trial and appellate lawyer for many years, David O. Stewart has published 11 award-winning best-selling books on history and historical novels. Prior to that, he was a reporter for the Staten Island Advance, and for 10 years wrote the monthly Supreme Court column for the American Bar Association Journal. David has done on-air commentary for CNN, C-SPAN, Bloomberg News, and MSNBC. In 2023, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Washington Independent Review of Books. His most recent fictional series, The Overstreet Saga, is inspired by family stories his mother told. He lives in Maryland with the light of his life, Nancy Florine, who is here. They have 3 children and 6 grandchildren. David's newest book is A Democracy We Must Keep, 7 Founders, 9 Documents, and the Ideas That Shaped America. So please welcome David Stewart. David, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm trying to thank everybody here. I'm very touched and pleased that you made time in your beautiful weekend to come here.
So first off, this really cool book. I read it. It's a very important book, by the way. Why don't you just tell us briefly what it's about? And this is usually when I ask the fiction authors not to give us a spoiler, but I think we all know how it turned out. But so go ahead.
Well, we're still waiting to see how it turns out, and that's what prompted the book. The subtitle tells you it's 7 Founders, 9 Documents, and the Ideas That Shaped America. I was, like many of us, troubled by how things are going in this country, and there were symptoms of my problem. I would talk back to the TV screen when the news was on, so I turned off the TV. I worry about what my grandchildren would think, and we actually have a sample right here, August Evan Stewart. See if you can pick him out. I worried that they might think this is normal. The odd symptom was when I used to travel overseas, when I came back to this country, I would always be elated, just feel like I'm back in the land of the free and the home of the brave. This is great. And I don't feel that way anymore. I feel troubled. We do strange things, and I can't even get into the corruption of the last week. So the question for me was, what do I have to offer? What can I say that people might have a good reason to listen to? And I have spent 20 years learning about the founding era and writing books about it. And I thought, well, is this the country they intended it to be? And, what did they intend? We don't really go back and look. So I thought, I'm a word guy. Let's look at the words. And so I picked out these 9 key writings in the first 25 years of the nation and wanted to do a look at them. I also decided I wanted to do a short book, one that people might actually finish. I had to hustle to get it out, but here we are.
It's a little depressing that you have to write a short book so people will read it.
We all learn.
So, when you're talking about founding principles, and it's amazing how little people know about founding principles. So, from your perspective, it's good to define terms, right? When you're talking about founding principles or American exceptionalism, are you talking about limited government, rule of law? What you tell me? What are the major components of that?
Rule of law is the central principle, but also this term that we all learned in high school government class and moan inwardly when we hear it, which is checks and balances. which is nobody should be trusted with power. I mean, we're not a great species, and we react to power badly, and we abuse it. And the founders understood that because they didn't trust each other. So they built the Constitution specifically to have those checks and balances. So Congress enacts the laws. It's kind of an extended game of rock, paper, scissors. Congress enacts the laws. The president can veto them. Congress can override his veto. The courts can strike it down. Congress can change the court's jurisdiction, and round it goes. And, you know, there are a few holes in this system, some of it because it requires people to actually be responsible and discharge their duties correctly. But, you know, the most outstanding example of not having a check and balance is the pardon power, which is absolute. Nobody can change it. And look who's been pardoned in the last year and a half. The people from January 6th, the attack on the Capitol, if ever there was an affront to ordered liberty, that was it. Rich people buy pardons. They just buy them. It's contemptible, and that's what we've got.
So you're saying it's not in the original intent of the Constitution to have people say pre-pardon people? You know, it's not the easiest issue for me because there were some mass pardons that worked out that were necessary, and I'm sure were very controversial at the time. You know, Andrew Johnson pardoned all the Confederate soldiers. Well, we had to be a new country or a restored country. You couldn't have them all be traitors. But this particular situation is an issue, and the tradition, the English tradition, was the pardon power was absolute. They incorporated it, and you know we've always, and you hear the term a lot, and again, it's one of those terms that rushes by us. Traditional norms. We always had traditional norms about how the pardon power would be limited in its application. And we're in an era where traditional norms are trounced, and that's one that has been trounced. So, I mean, abuse of the pardon's been going on for my entire lifetime, right? I'm 60, and it's been going on as long as I can remember, where people are buying pardons, people are being pardoned for things they definitely shouldn't. What's the solution to that?
I wish I had a quick answer. I think, unfortunately, you would have to amend the Constitution, and I think Jill Lepore wrote an 800-page book about it, and I don't read 800-page books, so I can't attest to that personally. But she complains that we no longer amend the Constitution because nobody can agree on enough to amend it. I think you would have to have some kind of review. It would have to be bipartisan or multi-partisan. God knows where we're going to end up with in our party structure. And it would probably have its own flaws. But we now have seen, and you're right, it's not only the current administration. In previous administrations, we've had contemptible pardons. And that's something we shouldn't tolerate. We probably have bigger issues.
So does it, I mean, having studied this, does it concern you, like if you want to amend the Constitution, if you want to have like a convention of states, I guess would be the way to do it, that once you get under the hood and start tinkering, some really bad things could happen, like these unintended outcomes?
Yeah, it terrifies me. They would start with a blank piece of paper, and that would be exciting to the people in the room, and it could really spin out of control. You know, one of the things we don't think about much is the folks who wrote the Constitution. We're at that convention in Philadelphia. They had written 15 constitutions, state constitutions plus the Articles of Confederation, which was a terrible job. They knew it was terrible. That's why they were meeting a second time. But you learn from your mistakes. And this that meant that they understood that what you how you structure your government reflects the values and the morals of the community, and then helps to shape them. So you've got to be very careful how you do it. And that is something I wish I could have more confidence that we would have a convention today of people who were very solicitous and concerned about that, but I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I don't think you should be. So how did you pick these individuals, right? Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. How did you select these out of all of the founding fathers and the people who had influence in our founding documents?
Well, they're the good writers. I thought there would be I intended there to be sort of two groups of documents. The first being the revolutionary documents, and those are the stirring, emotional documents. And, you know, I started with Patrick Henry, which technically is not a document, but oh well. And the Declaration of Independence, of course, and Thomas Paine, because I came to his work later in my life, and I was just blown away how good it is and how smart he was and what a great propagandist he was, to be blunt. So those really very much suggested themselves. You had to have the Declaration and the Constitution. But then, you know, the country had what is sometimes referred to as a day two problem. You know, I think of it like the dog who chases cars, and suddenly he catches the car, and it's, you know, what do I do now? And they had independence, and the country immediately went into the dumper. You know, our economy was terrible. We were arguing with each other. The states couldn't get along with each other. It was not working, which is why they called the Second Convention. And that required a very different kind of writing, not great rhetoric, but thoughtful, foresightful writing. And that, of course, you have to do the Constitution, and then the Bill of Rights, because that's the rest of the Constitution. That's the part they left out by mistake or oversight. And then you have the Federalist, which is the best writing about the Constitution ever. And then I was blown away by Washington's farewell address. That was the last thing I read, and he was a smarter guy than we give him credit for. And then finally, Jefferson's first inaugural. Which was an attempt, one hopes, genuinely felt, to get over a lot of the polarization of the 1790s, which was actually a time of very vicious politics in this country. So that's how I got to him.
When were the politics good?
The politics were sleepier in other eras. You know, the 1920s, there wasn't much going on, except, you know, we forget about the Ku Klux Klan, and, you know, that was terrible times. So it's never been wonderful, but it has been better than it is now.
So, like, when you're reading these documents, I mean, what strikes me is just how brilliant it was, right? It was such a departure from thought before that. I mean, I guess so. I guess if in your studying of the founding fathers, like, how did they blend this sort of, like, you know, Rousseauian notion of democracy with Locke, you know, and looking like the individual, like you know, God-given rights that people would have. Like, how did they square these, like? Was it Montesquieu who did the separation of powers? You know, like, how did they blended a lot of history that was right before them and up into their era?
Yeah, I have to be candid that my mind seizes up when I have to talk about Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu. I don't. With my first book, I remember getting a question about how did this relate to the Scottish Enlightenment, and I thought, what the hell was that? I had missed it. And I find it more helpful for me to just think about these folks who had great experience in government. They had been running their colonial governments. They had been very critical of the British government and had thought and argued about it. They'd been writing constitutions, and they were very pragmatic. And underlying it all, and you referred to it initially as limited government, and what I would refer to as their mistrust of human beings. They just didn't trust human beings. And Lord, they were right. And so they wanted to have a government that could not go too far. There's this wonderful passage in the Federalist by James Madison, and he says, if men were angels, we would need no government and no laws. And the trick is you have to create a government that will control men, the people who are in the government, forgive me, men and women, but also will control itself. And that second part is really tough. And we've had trouble with it all along. I think we really have trouble with it right now.
Well, so I mean, that's the problem, right? Because government is made up of people, right? And so people are looking for power, but that's what they literally wrote. Like if you look at all the Federalist Papers, that's what they go back to time and time again, right? It's giving this limited authority to the government. And we are so far away from that now. Like, well, what do you think, based on your research here, what do you think these founding fathers would think of like what the federal government does and looks like today?
They would be astonished. They would not. I mean, the whole world would just be so bizarre. I mean, everywhere they went on foot or by horseback or in wagons. I mean, it's just all unimaginable. The news would reach you 4 weeks later. So putting that all to one side, I think they would be alarmed at the size and power of the government, and they would be stunned, I think, by how impotent our Congress is. Actually, our first 100 years as a country, Congress was the dominant form of our government. If you read newspapers from the 19th century, they're all about Congress. They barely mention the president. And when I read look at the feed from the New York Times in the morning, 2/3 of the headlines start Trump. Now, I'm sure he's a fine human being in many ways, but he's not that interesting to me. But he's made himself the center. He's on what was formerly known as the Kennedy Center. He's going to be on our $250 bill if he has his way. I mean, it's out of control.
So how do we go from, a government like for and by the people to a government where, and you see this, it's both parties, right? And you see it in different administrations, but where the government is giving privileges as opposed to people starting with the rights, and we've seen this sort of slow decline into that over the years. What do you attribute that to?
Honestly, a lot of it I attribute to money. Money drives politics in a way that has not been it's never been unimportant. I don't mean to be naive about that, but it's so central. I mean, if you read any article about a political campaign, it's who has more money and how much is it and how much outside money is coming in. And I find it boring, but it must matter because people are looking at it and care about it. And it does seem to move the needle. There are very clever people figuring out how to use these tools to influence votes. So I think that's a big part of it. And, no public official, well, I shouldn't say no. There was always that fellow from Long Island, but almost no public official runs for office because they want to be corrupt. But it's just the job involves raising money. The phrase, my wife was in elected politics for a number of years. At the time, it was called dialing for dollars. You'd go into the room with a list of big donors, and you'd have to spend the afternoon calling them. And they have special offices outside of Congress where they can go make those calls, and it's not on the public dime, and that makes it pure. These are things we can fix, we can change that, and we've chosen not to.
So, there's certainly an element of corruption to that, or money just brings corruption, like because of human nature. But if you're looking at like short election cycles, the next election campaigning starts almost immediately. Is the answer to that term limits, or what you say we can fix that? How do you fix that when money really does equate to free speech or the ability to get your speech out into the public's sphere?
You limit donations. You can do that. We had it. And the Supreme Court said it violated the First Amendment, and that was nonsense. Money is not speech. I was in law school we had a professor, Ralph Winter, who argued that case and persuaded the justices that money was speech. It's not. It's money. It's like saying corporations are people. They're actually not people, but our legal system says they are. We could change that. We could enact legislation that says that's not true. And we should. The problem is we don't have the will to do that, and we don't have the sophistication. So it can be done. We just have to be committed and have to have people who do not answer to the money interests to do it.
Something really wonderful.
I didn't mean to be talking about this.
we can get away from that issue if you like. I'm just curious. I was curious about the unintended outcomes too, right? If you don't have money, if certain corporations or people have money, they have a bigger megaphone because they already have the money, whereas other people need donations, right, to get the money. So you can see that going sideways as well.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay. So when you're talking about some of these principles, you mentioned like how it was all about Congress, and the founding fathers talk about this over and over and over again, right? The will of the people, the Senate, in Senate's the states, representing the rights of the states, and then you have this executive branch is supposed to be enacting these things and executing. How did we get to a point where Congress has abdicated their authority to the executive branch?
I can't give every step along the route. I think it probably starts with the New Deal, when suddenly we really needed and people wanted government to do a whole lot more than it had done before. And that started the momentum towards having a much more active, strong government and a larger government. And we've just gotten used to it. There's an analogy I've used, which I won't because it's too obscure. But the fact is, we are comfortable with doubt, and if government doesn't do these things, we are very concerned. And we expect different things from the government, and that has been an evolving morality. We expect government now to right wrongs. We never expected that. We expect government to look after people in need. There's a lot of people genuinely in need. It's not that they're lazy. They've had terrible luck, or they got sick, or they got old. And that creates a bigger government. And, that is going to happen. And it's not just us. That's across the world.
So when you're talking about like this perception of what we expect from government, if you're going back to like Woodrow Wilson maybe and the government bringing in experts and being able to this change in atmosphere within the government that we can solve problems, right? And then leading into like Roosevelt and more government programs on a broader scale. If that's changing public perception, but the Constitution, changed a few times, right? But the Constitution itself really didn't change at the heart of it. So why does public perception or public expectation matter when we have a limiting document to the role of government?
Well, one of the things about a written Constitution is it's very difficult to make it completely clear and completely specific and limiting. And particularly when you have a couple of hundred years of very smart lawyers looking for loopholes. And, much of what's happened has been, one of the things that as a young law student was surprising to me was to understand the Commerce Clause, which was expanded has been sort of the loophole that has created a whole lot of government power. The executive clause, which is Article 2, says the president shall be commander in chief. Well, it didn't mean that he was God. And that's how it is often interpreted. And these people who read Article 2, basically, I mean, he has the power to take care that the law is enforced. Well, the people who argue for huge presidential power think that includes concluding that it doesn't need to be enforced. Well, actually, Congress said it should be enforced. So it is a problem when you end up in the weeds and the law of unintended consequences takes effect, and we are not responding as a political entity to repair any of these holes that show up.
I feel like there's almost a motivational contradiction in that what we talked about earlier, right? With we're not all angels. So you have people in Congress who are self-motivated, and where the corruption comes in, right? That does happen. But so if people are self-motivated and people tend to strive for power, why would they not exercise the constitutional power that they have when they're pushing up against the executive branch? You see what I'm saying? It almost seems like a contradiction.
It's a great question. And, there are some quick answers that occur to me. It's not the subject of the book, but, if you are a congressman and you are looking at re-election and the president has great sway with your people and is going to endorse with your opponent or is going to direct his political action committees to give money to your opponent, suddenly you care a great deal about the president and you're willing to go along with things that you, in your heart of hearts, know you shouldn't. And I think we've been seeing that. The president has a lot of power to direct goodies to a particular district to make congressmen look good. And that's a very powerful tool that is definitely used. So we have to recognize that not everybody's a hero, and that's a shame because we really do need them all to be heroes.
So is there a fix for that you've thought of? Or what would the founding fathers say would be a fix for that?
They believed in elections every year. Just make you answer to the people over and over again. And that was the case in most state governments for a long time. Again, having watched my wife go through that, boy, that'd be a deterrent to running for office if you had to run for office every year. It's hard to predict how that would turn out. Would that turn out only the crooks ran? I don't know. It's a hard problem.
So because the country was so much smaller then, do you think like some of those concepts can be expanded to a country of like 330 million people? And running every year also runs into that, constant campaigning, right, that we were talking about.
It's the constant campaigning, and you would have, I imagine, voter turnout rates would go even lower because people can't, for some reason, we can't have people vote on weekends. They have to vote on a work day. So, it's a problem with turnout, and it would probably get worse. So, yeah, these weren't the subject of my book, but they all have consequences that would have to be thought through.
So in your book, you're talking about like the power of the executive, right? You're talking about with this place where we've come, they didn't want kings. This was all in reaction to the king and how everything they were doing was changing the nature of government. So we wouldn't have one person with this kind of power. So however, Congress got to that point where they've abdicated. How has this changed with like executive orders, right? So every president does executive orders. It's how they execute the laws and the policy that they're tasked to do. But we've seen a huge increase, right, in the way they're done and people legislating through executive order and through executive directive. So how do you think, how has that developed? Do you have some insight into that based on the way it was intended?
It was not ever contemplated, and it's a practice that has grown like topsy. Every president in the last 30 years has increasingly relied upon them because they get frustrated with Congress because Congress get deadlocked. But what I would like us to be thinking in terms of is the way Tom Paine started his wonderful common sense pamphlet with the line, "We have the power to make the world over again." Imagine having that power. Imagine the feeling they had at that time that they were going to start all over again. And we have to have that kind of attitude that it's not okay what we're living with now. He absolutely devastated the whole concept of kingship. I mean, he pointed out that the English dynasty had brought their country 8 civil wars and 11 rebellions. He said, why does anybody want a king if that's what you get? And look at what we have now. What we have now is dissatisfying to many people. It's only making us unhappy, and it's getting us into troubles around the world that very few people want to be involved in. And we need to be willing to rethink.
So, I can think of many executive orders from both the Democrats and the Republicans that were overstepping, that were basically legislating because Congress wouldn't act. And what you've heard from both parties is, well, if Congress won't act, I will, right? You've heard that from both sides of the aisle. So, I mean, it's almost an admission of what they're trying to do, right, from the executive. So, other than having it go all the way to the Supreme Court, there's really no other remedy, is there?
We need to have a Congress, and we need to demand a Congress that is functional. And the way to do that, I don't have a magic wand, but, Congress has given up its power in the last 40 years. And, we could see it, as there's a bunch of people here I know from my law days, and, we could see it. They would enact legislation that said, the agency should do this in the public interest. Well, wait a second. What does that mean? You're supposed to tell us what to do, and they didn't. And that's what has been punted and is punted every day. Look how much they actually work. Forgive me, but not so much. And it would be good if they actually did their jobs.
So what would the founding fathers say about, like, when an executive is frustrated because they can't get certain legislation passed? Would they look at that as a positive thing because they don't have this overwhelming will of the people or the consent of the states? Or would they look at it as this is not functioning? Like, I guess my point is wasn't that sort of how the Constitution was written, with this balance of powers, so that there would have to be overwhelming consensus?
The notion was, to be honest, to make things difficult to happen. And that's okay until it becomes paralysis. And maybe presidents get frustrated too easily. That's an easy argument to make. And they should just simmer down and do their jobs. But nobody's got power over these people except voters. And, we're the people who have to demand it. And we haven't succeeded in doing that yet.
So you mentioned the voters. Is part of the problem the ignorance of, like, the Federalist Papers and what the Bill of Rights says? Like, you see these polls all the time with kids in school. I have a book from 8th grade from like 18 something, and it's, I don't think a kid in high school could pass it today. It was really difficult. Are we failing in educating people about what our democracy is?
I think there is an awareness that we need better civic education, and people are trying to address it. I don't want to suggest that nobody is paying attention. People are. And I was very struck by, I mentioned Washington's farewell address, and one of his major themes there, in addition to stressing that union is the key, that every good thing that happens to Americans is because of our union. But he also insisted that, party strife, bitter partisan feeling was the worst thing that happened. And he sketches out a scenario where you have bitter partisanship, and each party takes a turn being in power And when they come into power, they settle their scores against the previous party, and then the next party comes in and they settle their scores against the previous party. And, does this sound familiar? I mean, he's writing in 1796. And then he says, and then some person who is either smarter or more fortunate than his predecessors decides he can fix it. If you remember the inaugural address by Mr. Trump in 2017 was, I alone can fix it. He held himself out as that person. It was an extraordinary statement. And what Washington wrote, and he co-wrote this farewell address with Hamilton, was that when that happens, what we will have is the ruins of public liberty. And I find that phrase utterly chilling. I see Hiroshima after the bomb. I see Berlin after World War II. That's what he thought we would confront, is the ruins of public liberty. And we ought to take that to heart.
Are you doing anything to get this book into schools, for example? I mean, just to go back to that, because I feel like if people understood these founding principles, they might be more willing to vote for them.
It's a nice idea. There's been at least one teacher of history who wants to try to get it into his school. But it takes a lot of work to set up a program like this one and the different things I'm trying to do. So that hasn't been job one. I would love to be part of an effort to do that. A friend of mine who assists with the online book review I'm involved with, Colleen Shogan, is working very hard on that. She's the former archivist of the United States, and she's engaged with those programs. And we should support those very strongly.
I mean, young people learn differently now, too. I can see this working as short videos even, right? YouTube, getting things out with ideas. And because some of this stuff is so brilliant that you're quoting in your book, right? What were the other things besides Washington's final address? Were there other moments in the Federalist Papers or Common Sense that really stuck out to you?
Well, of course there were, and I'll get to them. But just one of the things that blew me away about the farewell address is in the 19th century, teachers made students memorize the farewell address and recite it. Now we don't do that. That's mean. We can't force them to actually speak in public. And I could support doing that again. Make them learn the words and, incorporate them in their hearts. Because once you learn them at an early age, you don't forget them. We all know about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We have learned that phrase, and that is something that was drummed into us and we need to hang on to. But there is a lot more that we could.
When you mentioned you had to get this out quickly because you wanted to address the current situation, how long did this book take you to write?
I don't know, maybe 3 months.
That's remarkable. So, how much research you do? You've written a lot of historical fiction as well as nonfiction. How much do you do before you start a book?
Well, for the other books, a whole lot more. This book involved a time period I had already written 4 books about, people I had already written books about, and documents I had already written about. I did a 270-page book on the writing of the Constitution. So, the hard part was writing a chapter that was short enough. And that, my friend notes that here's the book.
Summer of 1787.
Summer of 1787, we'll show for the camera. Those are all things that we can focus on. For me, it was sorting through the texts themselves. This wasn't a research project. This wasn't, I want to find out, what did Locke say? What did Montesquieu say? As I said, that often makes me fog over. What I wanted to find out is, what did they say? And what did it mean? And how should we be thinking about it today? And that's what my focus was. It was liberating, frankly, not to write all those citations and footnotes, and also to get to the heart of the issue.
What do people get wrong now? Like when they talk about, you hear this all the time, right? People talking about the Constitution, a talking head on TV. What is it that people don't understand or they're misunderstanding?
A lot. One of the things that drives me wild, I did a book on an impeachment trial. They think impeachment is an effective tool, which it is not. It has never been an effective tool, and we should just forget about it. They think the president was intended to be all-powerful, which he was not. They think that the courts are supposed to be apolitical. And, Mr. Dooley, this wonderful newspaper writer in the beginning of the 20th century, wrote, well, the courts follow the election returns. Amen. We know that. And there are things we have to confront and deal with. Now, we also need to be sure that we are demanding of the courts that they not bring the judges not bring a political agenda to the court with them. And many do not. And that's something, again, I think there's also a sloppiness that people think, oh, well, the judges only follow the election returns. I don't think they only do, but there are some who do. The big issue for me, again, I always come back to Congress, and people have given up on Congress, and I think that's utterly understandable and a shame and not acceptable. That is the voice of the people, Congress, and it has to be remade, and the people in the institution need to be committed to doing that. My parents were involved in government life, and they knew people in the other party, and they were fine. They were good people. They were not enemies. And you have to be able to make things work. That's something I hope we can do.
So is there a way that we can rally around, like as Americans, around something? Because I think it used to be, and maybe I'm just wistfully remembering this, but it seemed that it used to be people around these founding principles and what our country stood for and free speech and some of the things. And we seem very divided now. Is that, do you think that's more from like a media or more from the environment where people are looking for clicks? Or is there still so much commonality between people, right? Even on opposite sides of the aisle. Is there a way to get back to that?
I don't have, as I said, a magic wand for that. I think we need to do it in our daily lives. We need to do it online. There are times when I think up some smart aleck response to something and decide, no, that's a stupid thing to say. And it might be cute, but actually it's better for me not to do that. And I think we all ought to have that limit, and maybe I don't respect it enough. I do think we should try to talk to other people. That's the only way to deal with it. It has become almost a verboten subject to talk about our government and our politics now, because it either creates great conflict or just gloom. I mean, just sitting around with a few other people saying, oh, woe is me, things are terrible. That's not a fun night. And we have to find ways to talk about them in a more constructive fashion.
So we have so many authors who watch this podcast. I have to ask you a couple of writing questions here.
Please.
You're writing nonfiction and historical fiction. So which do you prefer, by the way, fiction or nonfiction?
Yes.
Do you spend time outlining in advance when let's say with your fiction? I assume you do it with the nonfiction.
Actually, I do it more with the fiction. With the nonfiction, there's the story. And I know what the story is. I've been researching it for a couple of years by the time I sit down to write. And I believe in chronology as telling the story. I mean, people try to do these loop-de-loops of time and, go back and forward. And I think it just confuses everybody. Life is lived chronologically, and stories of real things should be done chronologically. For fiction, I have to outline it because I have to make it up, and I don't know where I'm going. I had an aha moment with a very fine author. I won't name him because he might not want me to, but I asked him, so how do you write all these books? And he said, well, I write 80-page single-spaced outlines before I write the book. And I thought, I was a lawyer. I thought I can do that. And you still change it as you go along. You write a lot of fiction. But I did always need, with the novels, to know where I was going. There are all these authors who say, well, I just listen to my characters and they tell me the story. And I tried that once, and my characters, if they knew the story, were not telling me.
So when you're writing these, are you writing in Scrivener or Word, or what's the actual process of writing?
I write in Word. I love being able to search for things. I'm not a technically talented person, and I'm not a digital native, and I need something I can just manage without requiring attention and focus on the content.
You're so prolific. When you were first starting, I'm always curious about this, the building a writing practice. Were there things you did to create this habit? I mean, that's a lot of work you're talking to get this number of books out. How did that start, and how did it evolve?
Well, it's not bad to come to writing from a legal career because you get used to working a long time. I had a great experience as a young reporter. I was sort of swanning around the newsroom saying, I don't know how to start this story. And this older fellow just looked at me impatiently and said, first you write the first word, then you write the second word. And that's how you do it. And stop agonizing. It's not going to be War and Peace. Nothing else has been. And you can go back and fix it. That's the wonderful thing about cut and paste and delete and all those tools we have. Just get it down and do it. And I'm not saying race through it, but be sure you do it. And you do sometimes get to a point that's a problem. I refer to it sometimes as writing to the hole. And suddenly I realize, oh shoot, I don't know what happens next. And you got to stop and either do some more research or figure something out. But, you just do whatever the day requires. I'm always impressed with these people who say, I write from 7 to 11 in the morning and then I play golf. Oh, mazel tov. I'm glad for them, but that's not my day.
Do you have writing goals like word counts or page counts?
Yeah, I got ruined by Stephen King, who said he writes 10 pages a day, and that's a lot. There are writers here who know that. But I will admit that it's ingrained in my head, and I try to hit that.
So in writing, there's the writing part of your bit, and then there's the business, right? The craft and then the business. What do you do to get the word out? And have you found things that work to get this book into people's hands? Because this is an important book. I would like to see people reading this.
I'm open to ideas. It's not a simple thing. And one of the things you discover is literary publicists have relatively few ideas as well. It's wonderful if you have a friend who will book you on a national TV show. It's really difficult to do that. My older son has been in PR, and he told me with my first book that what I needed to do was get into a public argument with somebody more famous than me, which I think works, yeah. Although I've never done it. So it's a difficult thing. One of the things we do is we go around and we try to talk to people and explain what we're trying to do and why it should matter.
Did this writing come out of like your as an attorney and working and seeing what the shape of the country, or did you always have this bug to write? Were you writing as fiction as a child?
Yeah, it's embarrassing, but the answer is no. I hit the point in law practice, and I loved law practice for 25 years, and then I didn't. I just stopped, and I had to figure something else out. I needed Act Two. And I just woke up one day and said to my wife, gee, maybe I could write a book. And she said, sure. Mentioned the Writer's Center in Bethesda. I could take a class. And it turned out to be a great thing. So it came out of my need, not so much the world's need.
And it's so nice though that you have your wife giving you that kind of support. So not everybody has that. Is she your first reader?
She's an early reader. She finds it frustrating that I don't always say, yes, you're right. But I value her views on all of these things.
So how do you know when a reader is giving you good advice? Was it hard for you to disassociate like yourself from the writing? Are you able to look at it objectively and take in that kind of feedback?
Well, there are people around here who have given me such feedback, and we should probably ask them what my reaction is. I always view dealing with an editor, which is like an early reader, as, and this is probably twisted out of my legal background, as sort of a negotiation. You know, there are a certain number of things someone's going to tell me that are just right. And I say, fine, okay, you're right, I should do that. And there's a certain number of other things they're going to say which are just wrong. And, you know, we don't need to talk about them. And then there are a few where I need to understand better what the problem is, and maybe we can sort that out. And that's how I tend to approach the feedback issue.
All right, I'm going to go around if you're okay with it, and then get some questions from the audience. I would just ask when they ask a question, maybe just summarize it in a couple of words, what your answer is about for the recording.
Okay.
Okay. Do you have any questions over here on this side?
This is probably not a question that can be answered here, but in looking at the increased polarization of the two-party system and the increasing number of independent people who call themselves independents and don't like either party, also generational factors fit into that. Where would we be today if we had been a parliamentary system instead of a two-party system?
The question is, would a parliamentary system have served us better than a two-party system? I think you can see lots of dysfunction in parliamentary systems, and I think they have their own. What was it? Italy had 47 governments in 49 years. Madison said another wonderful thing. He said many of them, but one was, no form of government will make any difference if the people lose their virtue. The constitutional system was what our founders moved towards, and it's worked pretty well until recently. And I think, it's what we have. I wouldn't overturn it. And it's just impossible for me to reconsider that. And one thing about the growth of the independent voters, my personal experience is people are independent voters in the way that I had a friend who was an independent voter, which meant he was a Republican. He just didn't like saying it. And other people are, they're Democrats. They just don't want to say it. They want to say an independent. They like how it sounds. So I think the growth of the independent voter is somewhat overstated. And people do declare themselves as independent, and I say this very candidly, stupidly, because it means they can't vote in primaries where you can have more impact than you might even have in a general election. And if you are an independent Republican, vote in the primary. You can always vote for whichever candidate you want in the general election. So that's the end of my speech.
We have other questions here?
Hey, Dad. So we talked a little bit about, Washington's farewell address and how they used to memorize it in school. And, your grandson's right over there, and he skimmed through your book earlier today. But I'm thinking about for your grandkids and everyone's grandkids and kids and just kids in general, what founding texts do you think are kind of most approachable? The ones that we should be kind of, handing to a fifth grader, a sixth grader, seventh grader that aren't going to make their eyes glaze over, that actually are interesting. The Thomas Paine stuff, I hadn't read much of that, and I found that pretty interesting. I'm curious what you think.
I would steer them away from the Constitution itself. It requires too much context. You can read the Declaration and kind of get the meat of it. And I do like the Paine material and excerpts of the farewell address. There are parts of it, where he tells people to pay their taxes, and school kids don't need to read that. Oh, it wouldn't hurt them. But I do think some of his message is so powerful and is readily understandable.
Hey, Tim.
Jack.
You've spent more time with the Founding Fathers than anybody I know. So if anybody can get past the marble exterior, it's you. So tell us a little about who these guys were.
Oh, my. Yeah. Well, you'll want to leave sometime today, so I'll do this as quickly as I can. One thing that always has impressed me is when I'll see the libraries of these people, and they're small. If you had 200 books, it was immense. That was a huge thing. And I realized they didn't have that many books, but they actually read them. And they read them carefully and slowly. And, when you read about Abraham Lincoln as a young man, he would walk for 5 miles to borrow a book from somebody and then would memorize parts of it. And we don't have that technique mastered. Our attention spans, this is not a new thought, are much shorter. And I think that's the difference between that generation and us 10 generations later. They also had gone through this terrible war with Britain together, and we tend to ignore how bloody and awful it was. We've only had 2 wars in our country, the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and they were both horrors and really left a heavy imprint on us. It's so much easier to fly some troops somewhere and, they can fight for a while and then you bring them home and, nothing's happened over here. The home folks are unaffected. And they had been through that. And I think it made them serious about the government in a way that we aren't. There's a wonderful French phrase describing people as, or a person as an homme sérieux, a serious man. And I'm not sure how many people in our public life I would apply that name to, but the people in that era, who I'm quoting from in this book, all were serious people. And that's, I think, a big distinction.
Questions?
Hi, David. Thank you for this timely book. As you describe in your book, Thomas Paine wrote The American Crisis to rally the American people to the revolution. Madison and Hamilton wrote the Federalist Papers to educate the American people about a constitution that had not yet formed. And it seems that many Americans now possess a constitution but don't understand it. Do you believe that there is a need for a public forum where the average American citizen can go to be educated and to debate these issues And what might that forum, that public forum, look like?
It's a great question. I don't have a snappy answer. I do think that would be a great thing. One of the problems we have, and this is not a blinding insight from me, is we don't have public forums with each other so much. It's all online, and it's bloodless, and you don't have that personal connection. I mean, frankly, you can't be as snarky in person as you are online, and that is a real advantage and one we've lost. So I think in-person events are terribly important. It's wonderful to have one like this, and we need to see if we can grow those.
Other questions?
David, thank you for sharing yourself and your ideas with us. I have two suggestions. One,
You always did.
well, this is one that I hope you will enjoy, because I'm an admirer of Timothy Snyder and his book on tyranny, but I was very grateful when he decided to create YouTube program videos, one for each chapter, one for each of the 10 ideas that he has for objecting or fighting against tyranny. So I just thought that would be a wonderful way for you to share your ideas.
It's a good idea.
Just digest that. The other one is, now I go to all these No Kings rallies and stuff, but I'm developing an oppositional viewpoint to that. And that is, I'm thinking maybe we need a king. So if we end up with somebody who's a little bit narcissistic, a little bit needing ego padding and stuff like that, we could just, if we had a king, we could just let that person do that. Put his or her name all over the place and, dress like he wishes or she does, whatever. And then we have a little person, either a man or a woman, wearing a gray suit. That's the president. And that's the person who does serious stuff. I'm talking about the Nordic countries, actually, where we never know who the prime minister is. The royalty don't even get that much. But I've often thought that there's a problem with this deification that's going on, the cult and everything. And that seems to go with royalty. So, yes, kings, but also prime minister. Also president, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's just a thought.
And I like the first one better. But, I'm more concerned that we try to work on our current system. So I'll just leave it at that.
David, this is great, and thank you. Gerrymandering is such a problem because people don't have choice anymore. And I wondered if in the Federalist Papers or anywhere, the founders previewed that, because I know that Eldridge Gerry, who was a founding person, was the father of gerrymandering. So it obviously goes way back, that process. Did they have a sense of how harmful it could be?
Well, first of all, I think you were the person who told me you'd been in school with a descendant of Eldridge Gerry, and you told me to pronounce it Gary and not Jerry. That was not you? All right. No, they had no sense of it. They didn't have these cool computer programs that allowed them to design a district, so you went over to the left for 20 feet and got 4 more Democrats, and then down to the south and got more. So it wasn't really popular until finally it was Gouverneur Gerry, and that was in 1810 or so when we first had the term used. And we had to learn or sort of invent devious politics. You know, Aaron Burr was one of the great inventors of our political hustling. It all seems to have come from the North. They really didn't know. They didn't expect there to be a party system. There hadn't been a party system. It was kind of dumb of them because England had a party system. But several wrote later, gee, we didn't think about that. So they didn't anticipate a lot of this.
David, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I was very taken by the question a minute ago, and I just wonder, what do you think Thomas Paine or people from his generation would make of the fact that today, 250 years later, it would take the King of England, Charles III, to come to America and get up before the United States Congress and remind them of the importance of separation of powers and limitations of power that began with the Magna Carta?
I think he would have been as mortified as you and I were.
Final question over here.
Hey, David. Trump is obviously what they feared most. If they could have imagined somebody to fear, it's him. God knows I fear him every day. And I'm going to get my passport redone before he can put his face on that too. Were there conversations, as much as they were skeptical about human nature, were there conversations of other things that they thought they might put in, could have tried to answer our dilemma, which is basically there was a human compact. And I think nobody thought somebody was going to come along and just ignore it all. Was there anything in any of the writing where there was another stronger method?
Yeah, the short answer is not really. They toyed with different ways to choose the president. They were all bad, and the one they chose, the Electoral College, is also bad. And you know, they thought the impeachment power would work, and you know, they made a mistake. It doesn't work. You could have a recall vote. There are lots of mechanisms they might have included, but they were drawing on English tradition. You know, the impeachment power had been used not only to remove people from office, but actually chop their heads off. And they thought, well, that'll work. And it just has not, for our own reasons. It turns out it's very rare for one of our parties to have more than 2/3 of control of the Senate. And without more than 2/3 of control of the Senate, it's not going to happen. So it doesn't happen. And I think that was a misconception on their part, and partly because they didn't foresee the partisan system.
Idea for you: go to the National Library Association convention. Go talk to them.
Give me an email address, so I'll be in touch.
I have people. I'll send it to you.
Thank you. All right, so David, where can people go to find you and your work? Besides right here at the front of the room at Elaine's.
Yeah, I'll be here a little while longer, but I'm going to be around I'm mostly digital events like this will be as well. And, the work is available largely through online retailers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and bookshelf.org. I'm sure if you went to your local bookstore, they could order it through their regular supplier.
And you have books here for sale you'll be signing after this, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. So he'll be up here as soon as we conclude. I just ask everybody, if you get a chance, go on to Amazon, rate his book for him. It helps people who haven't read him before to discover his work.
What he said is important.
It really helps. It makes a big difference. This is a really good book. There are important ideas in it, and it's really well written. So congratulations on this book.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.